Constance Steinkuehler. I'm an associate professor here at Curriculum and Instruction at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've done most of my work, or I thought the majority of my work, was about games and their role in teaching kids how to think about and learn in various domains. So I've cut my teeth for most of my career studying games and their intersection with literacy, with science, with mathematization. So for example, how do you use mathematical models in the world? And a lot of my early work focused on things like the forms of reading and writing that go into games like RuneScape or World of Warcraft, popular commercial games. So to give you an example of the kind of studies I do, we would set up, say, after-school programs, oftentimes targeting populations that hate school but love to game, and then look at what their practices are around their gameplay and how they might intersect, if at all, with schooling. And across the board, what we found after a good decade of this work in our lab was that the work that kids are doing, the intellectual content of the work that they're doing in their play spaces, is oftentimes as complex and sophisticated and on par with the work that they're doing in their classrooms in middle and high school, sometimes even more sophisticated. So we got more and more interested in questions around why would sort of content learning, literacy, etc., why would that be so compelling in a play space versus a school space? And we ran some studies on it, and eventually over the years came to realize that while I thought I was studying a technology or an interactive medium of games itself, a kind of version of a technology like film or television, the more you looked closely at what kids were doing, you found that that actually you were studying kind of interest-driven learning. So one key fundamental difference between classrooms and games are that games are interactive spaces for kids to make meaning, that the goals are clear, and that oftentimes their interest is not taken for granted or ignored. It's actually the fundamental starting place of where schooling and learning, in this case learning, happens. And when interest is put first, it really shifts your model of teaching and learning. So, I spent a good 10 years thinking that I was studying how games could be used toward various educational ends. But in the last several years, I've realized that in fact what I am in fact studying is something more along the lines of how, education can play a role in kids' goals and activities outside of school. So when you shift your model from thinking about games as the medium to something like education ought to be the medium, you get a very different model of teaching and a very different model of learning. Teaching becomes something more akin to community organizing. And games, rather than thinking of games as these sort of, vehicle for learning in the content domains, but more efficiently or perhaps with better data streams for assessment, which is highly funded and very popular work to be doing now. So rather than thinking of games in those terms, you end up having to think about games as kind of a Trojan horse for progressive pedagogy. So you end up with games being perhaps the vehicle that reimagines the relationship between a student, a teacher, or a mentor, and the content area itself. Imagine a world in which education were held to the standard that all children should have a clear understanding of why they're learning what they're learning, and that their learning ought to serve their ends versus serving assessment structures so they could get through gatekeeping. I think you'd end up with a much more liberating version of what education could and can be.